Hello everyone, and welcome to this first lecture of Unit 1 on ecosystem vitality. As you've read in the text introducing this unit, we'll focus on four key aspects of freshwater systems that are fundamental to their condition and health, namely water quantity, water quality, basin condition, and biodiversity. For each, we'll look at why and how it is important to freshwater health, what pressures impose stress on it and thus reduce health, and how we can assess the condition of each in the context of basin-scale freshwater health assessment, using Conservation International's Freshwater Health Index as our organizing framework. So let's begin with the defining aspect of freshwater systems, water, and especially the quantity of water. We'll begin by looking at the natural controls on the quantity of water in freshwater systems and natural variations in water quantity across different seasons and years. Next, we'll look at how native freshwater biota depend on these natural variations in water quantity in their own life histories. We'll also briefly look at the pressures that alter natural water quantities. And finally, we'll consider approaches to assess this alteration and describe the freshwater system's condition with respect to water quantity. Let's begin with a river example. I described water quantity as the defining aspect of freshwater systems because the quantity of water determines the spatial extent of the system and many other physical and biological characteristics. This is a photo of the Mara River in East Africa, where it crosses the border from Kenya into Tanzania and flows into Serengeti National Park. You can see that it's a modest-sized river, perhaps 40 meters wide and less than a meter deep in this photo. But that modest quantity of water represents the entire habitable world of the aquatic biota living within the river, including more than 20 species of fish and many more species of insects and plants. You can see that it's a low-energy environment characterized by gently flowing water and limited habitats. We see other vegetation and potential habitats near the river, but they're inaccessible to the river species. But this snapshot of the river represents only one day in the life of a dynamic, natural, and free-flowing river that on another day may appear like this, greatly expanded in size and changed into a fast-flowing, turbulent, and turbid system. Note the change in color due to increased sediment load and the inundation of those areas we previously saw were inaccessible to river organisms. The quantity of water in the Mara River varies naturally between these extremes annually according to the seasons, and native freshwater organisms are adapted to both cope with and benefit from these natural variations. Natural variations in river flows are strongly related to climate and patterns of precipitation. Characteristics of drainage basins such as topography, geology, soils, and vegetation also influence how and how much precipitation will ultimately be routed into rivers, or lakes, wetlands, and aquifers for that matter. This figure provides an example of the relationship between precipitation and river discharge over a 3-month period in Holiday Creek, Virginia, in the USA. Note the high and relatively brief pulses of flow associated with the individual rainfall events, linked by periods of lower and generally declining discharges. The pulses associated with rain events are flood flows, when rainwater is briefly added to the base flow of the river. In the periods between rain events, the river flow is sustained by base flow, which comes primarily from groundwater sources and also rises and falls, but more gradually. Viewing the relationship of discharge and precipitation over such a short period illustrates the day-to-day relationships between flow and rainfall. But if we now stretch the x-axis to cover an entire year of flow, seasonal patterns, if present, begin to appear. This figure shows the annual variability of flow in Poplar Creek, which is in Tennessee, a relatively humid area of the USA where rainfall is fairly evenly distributed throughout the year. We still see variability and floods linked to major rainfall events, but these may occur at any time of the year. And although it's not obvious from this figure, there is a steady base flow in the creek year-round. now contrast Poplar Creek with the Frio River in Texas, which is in a more arid region with highly variable rainfall throughout the year. In arid climate zones, rivers, especially smaller rivers, may naturally flow only temporarily during the year, perhaps seasonally or even in response to individual rainfall events. You can imagine that these arid zone rivers will support very different biotic communities. A final example is the Little Blackfoot River in the mountainous area of Montana. In high elevation or high latitude drainage basins, precipitation will fall as snow during the winter months and be naturally stored until spring when temperatures rise and snow melts. Such basins are characterized by highly seasonal flows, with large and extended flood flows occurring in the late spring and early summer. These examples reflect the dominant seasonal patterns that commonly occur in the natural flow regimes of rivers. Now, imagine the incredible diversity of natural flow regimes that may occur in rivers across larger scales. Climate changes continuously between the extremes we considered in the last slide, and flow regimes change continuously as well. This slide also illustrates the sort of interannual variability that's possible. Each of these figures is for a single river, but represents flow data from different kinds of years. An average year is presented in blue, dry year in yellow, and wet year in green. Large natural variability in flow is also expected between years, and again, native biota will be adapted to these ranges of variability. Water quantity also varies naturally in lakes due to direct precipitation onto lake surfaces, as well as changes in the inflows and outflows of rivers and groundwater systems connected to the lake. Variations may be especially high in small lakes, but even in great lakes like Lake Victoria, there are clear natural variations. The lake and its basin lie in an area of East Africa that experiences 2 rainy seasons per year, one in April and May and the other in November and December. Lake levels change naturally in response to these annual rainy seasons. Lake levels also show longer interannual trends related to longer-term trends in precipitation. Changes in lake levels primarily affect littoral habitats along the lake margin, which are ecologically important. And finally, it's important to note that groundwater quantity also varies naturally in ways that are important for freshwater health, especially in groundwater-dependent ecosystems. As we just saw, base flow in rivers is dependent on groundwater, and so may be the water levels in lakes. Other systems, such as depression wetlands, are also strongly dependent on groundwater levels, and biota inhabiting these systems will likewise be adapted to natural variations in groundwater levels. Now let's look a little closer at the relationships between flow variability and aquatic biota. Consider this cross-section of a river corridor showing a variety of different habitats created by the river flows. Each of these habitats may have special characteristics of ecological importance for feeding, shelter, and reproduction, especially to highly mobile organisms like fish, birds, and insects. During low river stage, available aquatic habitats are confined to the main and perhaps secondary river channels, as well as backwater lakes near the channel. While at high river stage, the river rises and activates additional aquatic habitats of the river floodplain. The extent and inundation, and thus total area and volume of habitats, depends on the magnitude of the river flow. But the frequency and duration of these flows are also critical because they determine how regularly the habitats will be available and how long they'll persist. Life histories of native river species will be adapted to and synchronized with the seasonal variation in habitat availability. Flow variability is thus essential for forming and maintaining habitats, for connecting them laterally and longitudinally in river corridors, and for supporting and even cueing important events in the life histories of river organisms. An example of the interrelations of natural flow variability and ecology is illustrated by this graphical model of the Savannah River on the east coast of the USA. The American shad is a fish that migrates upstream from the ocean in the spring to spawn. Its eggs hatch and larvae develop over the late spring and summer. In the autumn, the adult fish return to the ocean to overwinter, before the whole cycle repeats itself the following spring. Note from the hydrograph at the bottom of the figure that the spring migration is synchronized with rising water levels that enable movement to spawning areas. Floods later in the season are important for dispersing larvae downstream. In a similar seasonal cycle, bald cypress trees drop their seeds into rising spring flows that disperse them throughout the river system. Seeds then germinate on moist river banks exposed by the falling water levels. Finally, warblers migrate from South America to breed in wetlands created following the river's spring floods. The people living along the Savannah River are closely linked to these ecological events and the natural resources they provide. Similar relationships between flow pattern and timing and ecological and social conditions occur in all of our river systems around the world. Water use and management routinely alter the natural flow regimes of rivers, especially where large storage is concerned. This is Flaming Gorge Dam and Reservoir on the Green River in Utah, USA. The Green is a headwater river of the larger Colorado River basin. The dam was completed in 1962 and is used mainly for hydropower generation. The reservoir holds 4.7 billion cubic meters of water, which is nearly an entire year's worth of flow in the river where the dam is located. The blue line in the graphic to the right shows the natural variability of Green River flows throughout the year, which has the classic form of a mountain river with low winter flows and high flows in spring and summer associated with snowmelt. The red line shows the regulated flow downstream of the dam, which is relatively constant throughout the year to provide a steady supply of electricity. The altered flow thus results in unnaturally high flows during the winter months and unnaturally low flows during the summer, both of which impose stress on downstream aquatic ecosystems, and downstream aquatic ecosystems have declined in health as a result, with significant losses of native fish species. At the other end of the Colorado River, near its mouth at the Gulf of Mexico, the river looks like this. High water demands for agriculture and urban areas in the middle and lower portions of the basin have completely consumed the river's water, and the lower river is dry year-round. There are many such examples of rivers whose water has been consumed to the point of dryness, whether seasonally or year-round. An example of seasonal dryness is the Great Ruaha River in Tanzania, downstream of a large area of irrigated agriculture. The dry section includes this portion of the river flowing through Ruaha National Park. The ecological consequences of such extreme cases of flow alteration are clear to see. Alteration of water levels and even complete desiccation is also a threat to lake, wetland, and aquifer systems. The quintessential example of disappearing inland water and aquatic ecosystems is the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea was reduced in size by 90% over the past 50 years, due mainly to upstream agricultural water diversions. This led to the nearly complete destruction of native aquatic plants and animals and the loss of related ecosystem services. Here's an example of seasonal alteration or regulation of lake water levels in Goose Pond, Massachusetts in the USA. Note that the lake's water level is drawn down by 1 to 1.5 meters each winter and then refilled over the spring and summer. Reasons for regulating lake levels include hydropower, flood control, and in this case, likely protecting piers and other lakeside infrastructure from damage due to winter ice. But artificial changes in lake levels like this impact lake ecosystems and especially littoral zones. So it's clear that altering the hydrology of freshwater systems, altering the water quantity, causes declines in ecological condition and thus freshwater health. And not surprisingly, research has shown that the degree of ecological impact increases with the degree of hydrologic alteration. But ecosystems are complex, so the relationship between ecological condition and increasing hydrologic alteration may take different forms. This figure illustrates the three main types of responses that are possible. Curve A describes a linear decline in ecological condition with increasing hydrologic alteration, while curve B describes a threshold response, where the ecosystem is able to resist low levels of hydrologic alteration but collapses after a certain threshold or tipping point is reached. Curve C describes a nonlinear relationship in which ecosystems are able to tolerate low to medium levels of hydrologic alteration, but condition and health decline more rapidly as alteration increases further. Curve C, in various forms, is likely to best describe the effects of hydrologic alteration in a majority of freshwater systems, as it reflects the resilience of systems to natural levels of hydrologic variation, as well as the breaking down of that resilience as humans push alterations beyond natural levels. Now let's transfer this thinking of degree of hydrologic alteration to a dynamic freshwater system. We learned earlier in this lecture that freshwater biota are adapted to the natural regime of water flows and levels, and even dependent on their seasonal changes to fulfill important functions in their life histories. These healthy systems are also resilient and adapted to the natural variability of the flows and levels. But as human interventions take control of the hydrological regime and alter it beyond the range of natural variability, the resilience of the system may no longer be able to cope and ecological condition or health will decline. So as part of the process of assessing freshwater health, we need to assess the degree of hydrological alteration or changes in the natural quantities of water in freshwater systems over the course of days, weeks, months, seasons, and even years. Let's now look at a couple of the widely used approaches to assess hydrologic alteration. A simple but effective indicator of hydrologic alteration is the Amended Annual Proportion of Flow Deviation, or AAPFD indicator shown here, and originally proposed by Peter Gerck of the New South Wales Fisheries Research Institute in Australia. The indicator is based on current and natural monthly average flows and provides an indication of the degree of alteration in those flows. In the equation, the natural monthly average flow N for a given month I is subtracted from the current monthly average flow for the same month I. The difference is then divided by the average of all monthly flows for that month. This result is squared to remove any negative signs and summed for all 12 months of the year. Finally, the square root of the sum is taken. Now, if the analysis considers multiple years of flow data, that annual result should be divided by the total number of years of data and the annual values summed. Higher values of AAPFD represent increasing hydrological alteration, and those values are distributed on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 representing an essentially natural monthly flow regime with no hydrologic alteration. Let's see how the indicator might be applied to hydrologic alteration in the Green River, which I presented earlier in the lecture. Remember that the blue curve represents the natural flow regime, and the red is the current altered regime. Taking the monthly values for each and applying the equation as described, we can calculate an AAPFD value of 4.96, which corresponds to a rating of 1 out of 10. This indicates serious hydrologic alteration, which we can see indeed is the case from the hydrographs. The FHI tool has the AAPFD indicator built into it and will do these calculations for you if you provide the input data. To conclude, I'd like to briefly introduce you to the Indicators of Hydrologic Alteration software developed by the Nature Conservancy. The IHA software enables a much more detailed assessment of the degree of hydrologic alteration. It's based on daily data and designed to compare natural and altered hydrologic regimes using data collected before and after significant interventions that alter regimes. It may also be used to quantify trends in alteration over time. It's usually applied to river flow regimes, but may also be applied to lake or groundwater levels. Taking rivers as our example, the before and after flow regimes are characterized by the magnitude, duration, timing, frequency, and rate of change of flows, expressed using 33 different statistical parameters listed here. I'm not going to mention each one, but I welcome you to pause the video and have a closer look. You can learn more about each parameter by consulting the IHA user manual, which can be downloaded at the link provided at the end of the lecture. The IHA software can also be used to calculate 34 different environmental flow component parameters, which apply exclusively to rivers and streams. Environmental flow components are types of repeating flows that are ecologically important. They include extreme low flows, high flow pulses, small floods, and large floods. This is an image of the user interface of the IHA software where thresholds distinguishing between the different flow components can be set. Flow types are distinguished by either setting percentage thresholds or calculating return intervals. For example, flows that are below the mean or median flow of all days in the period of analysis may be classified as low flows, and flows below 10% of all days in the period may be classified as extreme low flows. Thresholds for the occurrence of small and large floods are related to the return interval of the flood events. In this case, small floods are those with a return interval of 2 years, while large floods are those with a return interval of 10 years. These thresholds can be adjusted by the user based on flow and ecological conditions in their target river. The results of all statistical parameters generated with the IHA software may be visualized graphically or presented in tabular form. This is an image of the annual frequency of extreme low flows before and after the construction of Flaming Gorge Dam on the Green River. Occasional extreme low flows are important to the health of rivers, as they help control numbers of invasive species, enable the survival of certain native floodplain plant species, and benefit certain fish species. The IHA results indicate that prior to the construction of Flaming Gorge Dam, extreme low flows occurred in most years with a median frequency of 2 events per year. After the construction of the dam, there was an initial increase in the frequency of extreme low flows well beyond natural levels, but by the mid-1980s, extreme low flow events more or less disappeared from the system, with negative ecological effects. Like the AAPFD indicator, IHA indicators enable resource managers to assess the degree of hydrologic alteration, and they can also be used as a guide to the statistical characteristics that should be restored to hydrologic regimes. That brings us to the end of this lecture on water quantity and ecosystem vitality. We've learned that water quantity varies naturally in space and time in freshwater systems as a function of climate, geology, soils, position in drainage basin, and connections between water bodies. We've learned that native biota is adapted to natural variations in water quantity. We've learned human activities alter natural flows and levels, and ecological conditions deteriorate as the level of alteration increases. And the degree of hydrologic alteration may be quantified statistically using simple approaches like the amended annual proportion of flow deviation or more sophisticated tools such as the indicators of hydrologic alteration. Thank you for your attention. Please rewind and replay any parts of the lecture that were not clear to you. When you're ready, proceed to the hands-on activity for this topic. That's the end of this lecture.